Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Dancing into Brain Health podcast. I am your host, Magda Kaczmarska. Even as global populations age and the incidence of dementia continues to increase, the collective narratives of what it means to be aging and living with dementia continue to perpetuate deficit-driven, one-note narratives of loss. Such narratives drive fear and stigma, driving wedges between generations, further siloing individuals and expanding age-based isolation. Our guest today on the Dancing into Brain Health podcast is Michelle Memran, a documentary filmmaker and dementia advocate who has dedicated her life's work to transforming these narratives. Through collaborative visual storytelling alongside individuals living with dementia, Michelle amplifies the voices that most need to be heard while transforming the entire ecosystem of what we perceive living with dementia can and should be. Michelle Memran is a documentary filmmaker, journalist, and dementia advocate whose work weaves collaborative storytelling with social justice. As a senior Atlantic Fellow for Equity and Brain Health, she co-creates artful, impactful media with people living with dementia, amplifying first-hand perspectives to disrupt societal stigma. Her award-winning debut film, The Rest I Make Up, chronicles a decade-long creative collaboration and friendship with visionary playwright Maria Irene Fornes while she was living with Alzheimer's. Together, they discovered that a camera could ignite a new artistic practice for each of them. The film premiered at the Museum of Modern Art and was named one of the best films of 2018 by The New Yorker. Michelle is currently the University of California, San Francisco Library Artist in Residence, creating past advocacy, future change, HIV/AIDS campaigns transforming dementia narratives, and developing Let This Be a Symphony, a new dementia media advocacy campaign. Welcome, Michelle. I'm really, really excited for this conversation.
Me too.
I was trying to think back on how I first learned about you, and it was a little shout out to a colleague, Dr. Mark Rothman and the Dementia Spring. I first became aware of you at an event that they held at Canand a couple of years ago, and you were speaking about this film, The Rest I Make Up. It was a very short panel, but just even in that small moment of time, I knew that you were really special, that you're really incredible and remarkable human. And I'm really grateful that I've had a chance to see and witness and learn more about how you show up in the world. And I really love kind of witnessing the world through your eyes. I was reflecting, and I think I'm especially been reflecting about this recently, how you and your work, at least how I've perceived your work, invites this awareness that sometimes leaning into the unfamiliar and the uncertain, the scary things that happen in our life, those difficult situations that we don't anticipate but inevitably will appear, that in fact, many times they carry a certain light into our life, that they open up clarity and meaning and opportunity of connection that otherwise we may not be faced with. So I just adore your work. I've also gotten the chance to realize that, like many brilliant people who are in film and photography, you are a powerful listener and observer, but I don't often hear you speak about yourself. And I wonder how much of that is a constitution where there's an attraction, like what's the chicken and egg situation here? So I apologize if this is uncomfortable, but I would love to start with hearing a little bit about your story, or at least at this point in your life, how you perceive your journey to where you are today, like specific to this lens of storytelling. Like, how did that begin for you? I mean, you use many different media over your career, but I'm curious, what drew you to storytelling? And maybe if it fits the passion to collaborate with people living with dementia, because again, that's also really unique. I know that's a lot.
I first want to say before I go into that is that when we first met, you were becoming aware of me and at the Caring Kind, with Dr. Mark Rothman. But I had known about your work and was fangirling you. When you showed up, I was like, oh, that's I'd been following your work with DAA, with Dementia Action Alliance, and so when you came up to me afterwards, it was like a beam. You were like, let's talk. It's mutual admiration society happening here, and your work has really paved the way, and it's really amazing. So I started off as a writer. I mean, I started off as a small child, playing with my Smurfs in the closet. I mean, that's how storytelling started. Yeah, yes. Smurfs. So in the closet, which is sort of metaphorical, but as a married middle-aged lesbian, but like telling stories, creating my own worlds, and that was very personal. It wasn't like going outwards. But when I started doing journalism in high school, and I was a columnist for the local newspaper. And my first job was delivering the Southfield Eccentric, like as a kid, door by door. So I knew I wanted to be a journalist and had gone to the summer program at Northwestern, and then I knew I wanted to go to college there, and they had a journalism school. The idea of also creating change was really important to me, and sort of like following the early muckrakers and how can we actually make a difference with the work that we do. And so that's sort of the impetus to go into journalism. And then while in journalism school, my brother's an actor, and I became interested in theater, and in hindsight, probably should have majored in it, who knows. But the idea of the arts, and I was really focused on journalism but my brother was doing all of his creative work, and I would go see his plays, and I would meet all of these actors. And then I started writing. I took a playwriting class in college. This is a long-winded way to get back to what storytelling, but I wanted to be a playwright for a little while, until I realized I really wasn't that good at it. But instead of writing plays, I ended up writing about playwrights, and writing about actors, and writing about directors. And so that led me to covering, theater, and I worked as a, journalist in different magazines. And I started off at Newsweek, and I was writing about theater as a freelancer on the side while I was like a cub reporter there. And then became a reporter and researcher at different, and fact checker at different magazines. And that was the way I supported myself in New York.
Which is a difficult world. That's awesome.
Well, you have to find a way. If you're living in New York, you have to find a way as an artist. You're or a writer, or whatever it is you do, you have to find a way to pay the rent, right? And I was like, what is the way that I'm going to pay the rent? And I had all these other interests, So that was the steady, stable job. And I went in, I worked at Vanity Fair freelance for 16 years on and off at the New York Times Magazine. I would go there, I'd do my job. And then on the side, all these things these worlds were opening up. And one of those worlds that opened up to me was my favorite playwright, Maria Irene Fornes. I was doing a piece, an uncommissioned piece that ended up in American Theater Magazine. It was about playwrights responding to their critics. And I ended up just calling everybody that I knew from my brother, that I'd met, through the world of theater, and asking them to tell me a story about, a negative review and how they responded to it, and if they did. And I did 50 interviews. I interviewed, directors and playwrights, and Lanford Wilson and Christopher Durang and all of these people, and Edward Albee. It was Paula Vogel, and then Irene Fornes was my favorite playwright. And I had read her play called The Conduct of Life in college. And I cold called her from the white pages. It's funny, people would respond to me because I would say I was calling from Vanity Fair, even though I wasn't writing the piece for Vanity Fair. So they would get back to me. But Irene picked up the phone immediately, and I was like, oh my God, hi. And I don't even remember what I said, but I was very, intimidated. And I was like, I'm doing this piece, and, can I interview you? And she's like, sure. And so we made a date to go, and I showed up there, and I was on the corner of Waverly and 6th Avenue, or, in West Village, and she wasn't there. So I waited for about 15 minutes, and then there was a payphone right there. You remember payphones? Yes. And I called her. And I was like, Irene, it's Michelle, I'm on the corner. And she was like, okay. And she came bounding down the street, and we went around the corner to Bellucci's restaurant. All of this is in the film that we made together. The rest I make up. But so we had this remarkable, hours long lunch. and I just loved her. And I think she, and I think she liked me. And she talked about everything. And she didn't answer any of the questions that I had about critics and retaliating. She was like, I just don't, she could have really kind of honestly cared less. I mean, that was her. She put her work out there and people understood it or they didn't. And she kept going. Anyway, after that day, and I was on my lunch break from one of these magazines, and I went back and I had like taken the whole day off basically to spend with her. And then, whenever I was in the West Village, I would call her and we would go out for, coffee and we'd go out for lunch. And it didn't really occur to me, like what her private life was like. She just seemed to have a lot of time for me, which was great because I was like newly coming out of the closet at that point and was doing a lot of online dating, which I would tell her about and she would give me advice. Her lovers included Susan Sontag and Harriet Summers, all of these storied, famous, intellectual artist lesbians. So it was like, oh, she's giving me online dating for like Match.com and, whatever. But we spent all this time together and then slowly I started to put the pieces together that she wasn't traveling much. She was starting to repeat herself a bit and wasn't traveling as much and talked about how she wasn't writing really. And that was the piece that I was like, for somebody who was so prolific and had taught all over the world, why was she not writing? And then I went into her apartment for the first time and I was like, there's something not quite right about this, but maybe it's just the way, New York artists who've had the same apartment for 40 years, Coldwater Flat, and maybe this is, and I'd been in a lot of artists' apartments and that it seemed to be like, there wasn't that much that was out of the norm.
Yeah.
But like, certain things like, the fridge or, things that normally you would probably pick up on. So I called her agent, Morgan Janess, who is a wonderful human being who recently passed away. And she was a powerhouse. She had been an agent for everybody and a dramaturg and an advocate. And, so she was like, yeah, I know what's happening. We probably think it's something like Alzheimer's, the community's trying to rally. And so then that was sort of the moment where I came more often to Irene's house and brought food with me when I came. And then it was like, we're going out to eat and really kind of trying to think of creative ways we could keep something like, what's the spark? What could we work on together, And we would, sometimes we would do some writing exercises together. But the thing is that being with Irene, knowing that she was experiencing cognitive changes, being with Irene was the highlight of my life. Going to her apartment was, it was giving me so much. She was feeding me. It was like the highlight of my week, going to Irene's and sitting in her apartment and eating. I would bring her these subs from around the corner and there were these she loved them, but they were hard to eat with dentures, so it was like there would be some clickety clacketing and and I would be like, oh my God, am I ruining Irene's mouth by bringing her these subs? But we'd have the subs and sometimes we would go out for a beer or go out for a coffee. It was the best time and and also not without complexity, right? So I think that's a really important thing to point out too, is that there's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of really hard, devastating things that happen. Yeah. And also within that, there's a lot that happens in the day. There's a lot of joy and exultation and excitement and connectedness. And so I think, so I just want to say that because I do think that, there's not, you can't say that anybody would ever want to get Alzheimer's. It's not something that some people are like, oh, that's something I want to get, right? I'm a breast cancer survivor. I did not want to get breast cancer, but and I say survivor, I'm in remission, but having been through that experience, it has changed me in ways that I would have never anticipated, and I wouldn't give that experience back. And people are like, you wouldn't give it back? And I'm like, no, I wouldn't. So I think illness is complex. If we look closer, there's a lot we can appreciate and actually love about it. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going on a long-winded journey here with this story, but all that to say, Irene and I were on a beach one day and we had a camera. I had a crappy, Hi8 camera that my dad had gotten me. We turned it on I asked her if it made her uncomfortable, and she was like, "The camera to me is my beloved, the one who wants me always, and I give everything I have to a camera." And that was our collaboration. That was the moment that sparked the collaboration. And then I would go to her apartment with lunch and a camera that I didn't know how to use very well. And so there were like microphones flying off the thing. Things were in focus. They were out of focus. I still do the same. It's interesting because I'm so in the moment with talking to people. I'm like, is it in focus? Is the mic on? And being with Irene is the thing that we collaborated. She didn't get to sit through the edit with me, but she saw much of the film that ended up becoming the film. But it was this moment because it was the relationship and the mentorship that is the reason that I became an artist. And it was probably the closest relationship I've had in my life, besides my partner and my wife. And I saw something that people on the outside couldn't see. Not all the people, but they were seeing somebody who was no longer a person, no longer an artist, no longer creative. And so I wanted to make a film that showed a different story. And I know that this is something that I've talked a lot to Virginia Sturm about, empathic concern increasing in some people with Alzheimer's. And I think that happened for Irene. And in a world that seems increasingly moving away from empathy, like in certain realms of our government or corporation, it's this returning to people who have that quality. That's why I do this work, is because it's my experience has been that most of my closest friends are actually people living with either MCI or dementia. So what is that? I'm digressing. We should probably get to your next question, but I just had Sarah Langer, who's a neurologist who is living with Lewy body dementia. She's brilliant. I met her a few years ago when I was doing a video for National Council of Dementia Minds on doctors living with dementia. And she was one of the first people I interviewed. And she was like, "Michelle, I think women go underdiagnosed because they're not believed." And so she had a lot to say, and I just loved her from the second. I was like, wow, this woman. And I thought about it because she's gone on to become a huge mentor to me in neurology and teaching me about Lewy body. So Irene started off as my artistic mentor. And now in this phase of my life, as I'm working in this field, in this space around neurodegenerative disease and cognitive change, Dr. Langer is taking me on this part of this journey. I've been really lucky, to have these women in my life. And they're powerful presences. I like to be behind the camera. Like I like to be listening to people. When you get me talking, obviously I'm talking a lot, but these are women who also encouraged me to be vocal, like who encouraged me to be a voice when I didn't think that I had one. And then I didn't think that people wanted to hear it, So
can you say more about that? There have been so many moments of what you've shared that just resonate. But can you talk more about that? Because I'm curious, like, where does that come from? That you don't think that you have something of value to say, or that you don't have something to say? Like, where do you think that comes from?
Gosh, childhood? I mean, it's actually interesting, and this is a topic that we could probably dissect at some point later. But I feel like a lot of the people who do this kind of work well are the people I admire, many of them who are working in the dementia space or in brain change, are people who were not seen as kids. And I don't know if you've experienced that, if you've seen that, but and I think that that's also something that connected me with Irene, because she had a complicated childhood. I had a very complicated childhood. You see some of that in her plays. I think that this thing of seeing people who are not valued as human beings, and they're not given a voice or a platform to talk about what's happening to them, and then they're not believed about what's happening to them. I'm like, let's go tell their stories, because it's, in a way, telling their story is telling my story. And I know it's very different. I'm not living with dementia, although, I sort of plan for it someday but I think that, historically unseen people gravitate to other historically unseen people,
Yeah.
but it's also gravitating to a person first, right? So Irene was the doorway, and we had a lot of overlap,
Mm,
and there's a quality of presence. And when you're in the moment, there's no problem. And it presents problems for everyone else. And of course it does. There's the story of the person who is living with it, with the individual who's navigating it. And then there's the story of the care partner, and then there's the story of the doctor, and then there's the story of the child or the family or members who have an possibly hard time acknowledging that it's happening because of their own historical things. I mean, there's so many pieces to this, right?
Yeah.
But that's why.
I found different language around what you are calling not being seen. I think I perceived that, but I also think for many portions of my life, I didn't want to be seen because I didn't know what to do with that attention if it did come to me. And attention, when it did come, wasn't necessarily safe.
True.
I
Yeah.
became very aware of what now, especially, I'm finding that a through line for me has been a visceral yearning for connection.
Mm,
Like I want to feel connected to somebody, and yet
mm,
everything seems to be preventing that connection.
mm-hmm.
But then the first time that I felt genuine connection was through dance.
Mm,
You
yeah.
know, it was like now something, I can't name it, but I feel like we're connected. And now
Yeah.
I think I'm understanding like there's actual synergy in our brain, there's synchrony in our brain, there's music, there's rhythms that align. And so we actually do in some part overlap for a moment. Like there's a sense of that connection. Relationships take different paths, right? But I've witnessed, and my colleagues now in this work witness that over time, partners in care, whether they're familial, whether they're friends, whether they're partners, or whether they're professional, they start to develop a new relationship with the person who's living with brain change as well. And that feels really special. That we're somehow, by inviting them in a way that feels authentic to them, like sometimes that means that they're in the background on their phones and only tuning in every 5 seconds, for 5 seconds out of the hour. But somehow over time, they enter in more. And that feels really beautiful. Somehow we're cultivating an opportunity for discovering a new relationship, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That feels. And so when I think about like having seen the film, The Rest I Make Up, I know that we were talking about Irene, but a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
story appears very much in front of us when we watch the film. I think in a way that, I mean, it's a very different medium, film, but that's what you're doing for all of us in that film, I feel. You're creating an opportunity for us to give ourselves the permission to discover, to be in the moment, to be present, to have curiosity, to set aside the immediacy of recognizing change through loss and not allowing us to recognize change as emergence. It's amazing how quickly we fall into tropes.
Well, there's so much in what you just said. But I was thinking, when you're in something,
Mm,
when you're in a relationship or in a story, you're enmeshed in that. I mean, you don't have to be enmeshed in it, but you're in it. So it does require almost like the camera lens of zooming out
yeah.
and being able to contextualize all the things that are happening, and so it can give me some kind of like emotional or psychological distance, right? But I just want to go back to what you said about mirroring, because I was thinking about what you do. One of the dance practices that I saw you do when we at Encore Community Services, when
Yeah.
you came in to do that, I mean, folks, bring Magda Kazmarska in to your community centers, to your everything, because she led this. I'm going to speak about you in the third person. She led this, this extraordinary dance, brain health social, with a community, a room of 100 people, who are older adults, and many of them who were undiagnosed probably, but living with some kind of brain change,
Mm,
and changed the tenor and the atmosphere of the room in the
mm,
most beautiful, generous way. And people at that center were commenting after, they were like, "When's Magda Magda coming back? When's Magda coming back? But one of the most extraordinary exercises you did was the mirroring exercise, right? When we talk about being seen, it's not necessarily about being seen, but were you mirrored? You know, like when I say like I wasn't seen as a kid, I don't think I was properly mirrored, right? Yeah. That's so important. I don't know that there's like a through line to that thought, but I think we are talking about similar things, because if you're not given that, then it does become unsafe. And in a similar way, I think that for people who come in and don't understand what's happening with the person they love, and all of a sudden their spouse or their parent or their friend is not mirroring them, does not acknowledge, there's not that connection, it can become scary because it's like, what's happening? And then it's not a space that you want to keep going back into, right? But it's not to say that mirroring can't exist. It's just you have to find new ways to facilitate it and to creatively work together to reestablish that.
I love that we've kind of inadvertently arrived on identifying and kind of listening to your practice and how it's evolved and where you are now. It's interesting because in looking at the film, The Rest I Make Up, it does feel like dance and poetry and moving images. There's a communication and a sense making, but also like it's sense making, but it's not like it really just like people have to see this film. Watching it practice and meditation. It is a constant invitation to being in the now. I've been listening to and reading books about how much our attention, is being pulled away and disrupted and interrupted so much in our current society. So I almost feel that any opportunity that allows for you to practice in being in the now, being now, is a gift. Maybe serves you more than the individual who is inviting you into that nowness.
Well, and I'm always like, next 5 minutes, what's happening in the next 5 minutes? Because I do feel like moment to moment is how we can move through the impossible, because, I think in terms of when you're thinking about resilience and how do you have resilience for over time? I mean, we're seeing this, in so many areas of our world right now. Like, how are people living through, like threats or the fear or, whatever it is that we're living through. But I think that you have to believe in this moment. And I had a very good friend of mine who found out she had pancreatic cancer very late in the process. And they'd basically given her like a couple weeks to live.
Oh my
and
gosh.
In those 2 weeks, she expanded. She expanded like she was like letting love in. Wonderful human being who, had really like not let people in. And then all of a sudden she's like signing her emails love all day and the text messages love all day. I think if she could say this for herself, she might. That she lived more in those 2 weeks. She had more love in her life in those 2 weeks than in her 50 plus years. In some ways, I mean, maybe that's simplistic, but there was an openness, and she was having conversations with her family where she really felt seen for the first time. So it gives us an opportunity to say, hey, we all have a limited amount of time on this planet, and we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So what are we doing today? And this is the work that we're doing with people who are navigating that. They don't know what's going to happen tomorrow or what's going to happen in a year from now. They're a constant reminder, their humanity and their presence and their willingness to share what that's like with us, which is such a gift, right? They're reminding us that like all we have is this, Magda. This all we have is this. Like me and Magda talking right now is what I have right now, and it's all that matters right now. I mean, it creates issues around planning for the future and what is going to be there and how are we going to afford all this. I mean, there's myriad things to worry about in that, outside of that moment, but if we could change the framing to really see people who are navigating this and living with these varied conditions as our teachers and as our guides, wouldn't that be another way to see this? And I will say one of the things that has been so really heartening to see, because the film is mostly seen in colleges and playwriting classes. So on Letterboxd, you have all of these young students, young aspiring playwrights or actors or people who just seen the film in some kind of college setting are like, who's doing it like Irene? Some of the posts are about her having Alzheimer's, but very few. They're mostly like, when I'm feeling awful, I turn on this film so I can be inspired artistically. And that was the goal, like I was when I started that film. It took us 15 years to make. If young people can get from I sit with her like I sat with her on the screen, and that can be communicated, I mean, that mirroring is also happening in its own way, right? They're seeing who they want to be or what they want to be doing. And so how do we translate that, the experiences of all these people who were so, lucky to work with? How do we communicate that?
Well, that's a powerful medium because I work in an ephemeral medium, right? Dance is the most ephemeral. As soon as you do it, it's gone. It remains in that moment and you only have a reflection of it. And there's a value for those types of experiences. But there's a power in an object. It continues to live in its own way, right? It's always itself. And yet, every single time you engage with it, you have a new relationship with it, depending on who you are as that person in that moment, or who, the different people who engage with it. So I'm in awe, and I'm also like, I don't know if I could handle like my constitution, if I could handle the responsibility of deciding what gets to be preserved in such a medium. I admire you for being able to negotiate and have the clarity of that. I imagine it's a different type of a flow, but I also see that that is so much you, and your unique, beautiful self being able to notice that is important, that needs to retain, that needs to be here because it is different, or because it exactly captures that feeling for me right now. And I want others, I'm curious maybe what others will, what they will see when they engage with that. It's such a, not to say that it's the only way, but it's such an important way. And we really need people like you who have nurtured that way of seeing, and then that way of transmuting that seeing into something that persists. And I love that there's young people who are choosing and getting an opportunity to witness that, and then finding a language that aligns for them around it. I'm so glad you shared that. It gives me hope. I'd love to hear a little bit about some of the things that are emerging for you now. You had just recently completed your fellowship with the Global Brain Health Institute, and now there's a few things that are kind of emerging out of that. One, first of all, I want to congratulate you publicly for receiving a pilot award for brain health leaders, or global brain health leaders, to develop Let This Be a Symphony. And then I also congratulate you on your current position as a University of California, San Francisco artist in residence at their library. In these last 12 minutes, would you be willing to share just a little snippet about each of these two emergent projects, which each of them in their own deserve its own episode? So this be a symphony, and then your current work at UCSF Library.
Sure, yeah. So actually it's not so hard because I think they're intertwined. As you mentioned, I spent the year at UCSF and I was an Atlantic Fellow at the Global Brain Health Institute. And so part of the year is developing this pilot idea. And so what I would do during the year, because I just love the UCSF library up in Parnassus. So it was like up top in the hills, and then Mission Bay, where we were, doing most of our curriculum, was down in Dogpatch. So I would take the shuttle up to the library and do a lot of my work there because the view is extraordinary. A clairvoyant once told me that I really needed to live in heights, that it was like good for my nervous system. So anyway, I just went up to the heights. And I loved it there. And I was doing all this research for my pilot on stigma and looking, and they had, this extraordinary medical library, and they had, books. So I was going through the stacks and, pulling books on AIDS and HIV and campaigns and media campaigns. And global, global interventions, global solutions, and then also early breast cancer advocacy and campaigns that were done around that. And so I spent a lot of time just reading books there and meeting the people. I could rent equipment there too. So I was meeting the people in the makers lab and meeting the people who were, in the media lab. And so I got really acquainted with the people there and really loved it. Dr. Sarah Langer was a mentor to me. She was saying the answer to dementia stigma is through early HIV and AIDS campaigns and their approach. And she said it multiple times to me. And so I really incorporated that into my pilot and how I was going to approach stigma reduction and tell a different story of dementia. The pilot is called Let This Be a Symphony. And it's a media advocacy platform, and it's going to have many different voices of people, living with MCI or various forms of dementia, partners in care, clinicians, researchers, dancers, artists, journalists. It's going to have, the ideal is that it's going to have all the voices. Yeah. But the first piece of this that I pitched in my pilot was these 6 media action groups. I pitched 6 media action groups creating 10 videos. All of the people in the groups are living with MCI or early to mid-stage dementia. And we're going to be creating these videos are based on a needs analysis that was done by National Council of Dementia Minds. And they did this analysis with 65 individuals who were, living with dementia. And they came up with 6 categories of topics that were most prevalent and prioritized in those communities. And it was like stigma, social, medical, financial, and legal, I think. I'll have to look at my proposal. Yeah. So the pilot is 6 groups of 6 to 8 people probably that are recruited cross-organizationally. So National Council of Dementia Minds is the home-based fiduciary, and then we'll be talking. I just talked to the Lewy Body Dementia Association, and I want to talk to DAA and sort of recruiting, so it's not just one organization and the same people. Yeah. So that's exciting. And then those videos will be varying lengths. But the thing in the middle of the video is that will come up, all co-designed with people who are actually living with these conditions. And then we're going to have a beta with some people I already know, so we can kind of iron out an advisory group of like, this works, this is going to be terrible. And so a real design template for that. Once we discuss what we're going to be talking about in the video, then at a certain point, and I think it's the 3rd or 4th week, we're going to invite outside experts to be in conversation about these other tasks. Like if we're doing a video on stigma and we want to bring in a journalist who writes about cognitive aging for the Wall Street Journal, they can actually have a conversation about it. Or if we're talking about legal issues and someone wants to bring in an elder care lawyer. We can kind of think about who, and it might just be really out of the box and really wild, which I hope it is, like bringing in philosophers and a death doula, like who knows what we could bring in, a yoga instructor, bringing in a dancer. So I think that the possibilities of that feel like really wide open, and they're all going to be following the lead of people living with. And then while I was working on it and writing it, I was kind of Googling around. I was like, are there residencies in San Francisco? And one popped up for the library. And I was like, well, that's a no-brainer. So then I applied for it, and I was already kind of doing the work because I was seeing things online. If you just take the early advocacy of the HIV and AIDS movements, some of it, you just take the word AIDS out or the word HIV out and you put the word dementia in. Yeah. It's very different situations, but in terms of the messaging and the urgency and the relatability and the boldness and the vitality of that messaging is what, in my opinion, is what's missing from the way we're talking about dementia. It's something we don't need to think about now. We don't want to think about it, And these were issues that people were dying all around you. So of course it was urgent. And it was based on affinity group models so that people were creating materials directly to communicate to their community. Yeah, so it felt so personal. And so that's the work that I'm doing now, which is going through boxes and boxes of materials and finding that messaging and then I'll have an exhibit in June with
Yeah, I
what
was
I
going to
found.
ask what you were just speaking about. Those visuals are just riveting, the messaging. And so it's going to be like a still gallery. Or do you think it'll be video?
Oh, it's gonna be well, I just found out we can't have video in the exhibit. So I think I will have video come out of it because I've done some interviews, but I think it's gonna be a very tactile exhibit where there's gonna be visual material. Like yesterday I found all these stickers. Things will fall out of a folder and I'm like, what are these? Exactly modeled after their campaign. So nothing was digitized. It was all pamphlets, buttons, stickers, postcards, different calendars. There's a calendar that's so gorgeous. It's called Every Day that they did. It was part of the visual aids exhibit. So it's really thinking through what those materials can be in an affordable way. But I'm thinking posters side by side of the original and then the exact replicas. And then people can take things away with them. I'll set up a camera in the space to interview people probably about if they have somebody in their life who's navigating this and what does it make them think of it. Like we'll kind of do that. And particularly in this moment in history that we're living through, because you're seeing people challenging the status quo every second of their lives because there was no choice, right? It's informed many things about both the work that I'm doing and what's happening around us right now too.
I'm glad that we got a chance to talk about these two things because they're emergent, and I hope people can interface with them and learn more about some stuff that's on the horizon. Would you be willing to share a personal moment of magic when you felt an experience, an artistic experience, so whether it's dance or music or visual art, either that you had or that you witnessed that felt like, oh, I see the magic of arts and health?
I'm just going to share a recent moment. So I mentioned this friend and collaborator, Sarah Langer, with you, but she recently came to San Francisco and we arranged for her to come and be in conversation with Caitlin Casaletto, who is a neuropsychologist and someone we both love at UCSF. Sarah had been following Caitlin's work, and Caitlin knew about Sarah because I'd shared information about both of them. So this moment was this convergence of these two women who I greatly admire, coming together as peers, not as a clinician and a patient, coming together as a neurologist and a neuropsychologist, to have a conversation about things that they deeply care about, being filmed by, me and a wonderful cinematographer who I met, Matt Rome, who has been so generous with his time and his everything. He believes in the work, and he works with me with my budgets, which is a beautiful, kind thing to do. And we look for those people who believe in the work. So, and it was this convergence of all of us coming together to make this, gathering happening, this meeting. And watching that and then being with Sarah after that moment happened and her being like, that was just the best, because she's like, I don't get to have those conversations anymore. This is the best for me because I get to bring these people together. All of them. We went out to, Sarah and I went to lunch with Matt after at Cinderella Bakery in San Francisco, and that was delicious. The whole thing was an exercise in being engaged and alive and connected, and also represented art and science and community and what's happening in the world. So I think that's a sort of encapsulation of a moment that just happened.
It's beautiful. I'm fully present in all the senses. Well, Michelle, thank you. Massive thank you for joining me. And I can't wait to see more.
Likewise, we got to keep going and figuring out ways to collaborate and make sense of this stuff, everything, all of the everything.
This episode of Dancing into Brain Health was edited and produced by me, Magda Kaczmarska, and Hillary Brown-Estreffi. The music for this show is the title cut from the album Critical Path by Joe Venegoni and Carl Weingarten. Show notes, links, and resources from today's episode can be found on the Dancing into Brain Health page on Apple Podcasts and Spotify.